Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 33rd installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO at Project Medtech. Today, we'll be hearing from Shawnnah Monterrey, CEO at BeanStock Ventures, for a conversation on no-code, low-code, and custom code, how to evaluate your software options. Within this discussion today, we'll be hearing more about learning to better evaluate software purchasing decisions, both platforms and service providers, what are realistic expectations in terms of cost, time, and ongoing maintenance, and how your decision will affect your go-to-market strategy in the near and long term. First, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. The company is ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is High Trust certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics here. As we go through, if you have any questions for Shawnnah, you can drop them on the right-hand side of your screen or left-hand side of your screen, depending on where your control panel is. And about halfway down or 3/4 of the way down, there's a little spot to drop in questions. There's also a couple handouts there as well. There's a Galen Data data sheet, and there's also a white paper that Galen Data has written on device connectivity. A reminder that you'll receive a recording of this webinar via email, and please feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional questions. With that being said, I'd like to welcome our guest, Shawnnah, to the webinar series. Shawnnah founded BeanStock Ventures following nearly a 20-year career as a technical leader. Shawnnah was responsible for developing strategies and leading complex global product development programs and functional management of software and software quality assurance departments for both startups and mature organizations, with emphasis on the development of medical instruments, life science, diagnostic, and clinical applications. Shawnnah, welcome to the Galen Data webinar series.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I gave a little bit of an intro there, but anything else to add? I guess for me, the first question I have is, how long has BeanStock Ventures been around, and what led you to finding that?
We founded in 2018. And so when I founded the company, the intent was to enable digital health. So I come from a software medical device background, over 20 years experience, well now 23, developing very complex software solutions for very large and small organizations. And when I ended up leaving, I noted there was a lot of my ex-peers and people that I've worked with before reaching out to help them build their medical device. And so initially we started out as a software consultancy where we did basically custom and very complex development. And then when COVID hit, we actually made a pivot. We had a lot of deep quality and regulatory expertise. And so we achieved accreditation. So we're 1 in 9 companies accredited by the FDA, which means we can review and approve select class 2 devices on behalf of the FDA. And we started seeing basically similar issues within the industry. And so we have a sample to answer analytical platform that we built. And then we also have what we call our grassroots, which is a community that includes training and design history file templates and everything that you need to satisfy the regulation focus on digital health. So we kind of took our consulting aspect and then built products based on the common themes that we were seeing, so we can still enable digital health, but at a larger scale.
Super cool. We're going to get into the actual topics here in a second, but the one thing that fascinated me, so I met BeanStock Ventures back in my LabCorp days at an event out at in Silicon Valley, and that was the first time I came across BeanStock Ventures. And one, your marketing's super cool and the logo and everything, and so I stopped by the booth, and you talked about how, yeah, you were able to clear and approve medical devices essentially as an accredited group from the FDA. Can you let's explain that a little bit more, what that means. I know you said you're one of 9, but what's
Yeah.
the benefit of this? Why would someone do that way? It's really interesting, and I wasn't aware of it for the longest time.
Yeah, I feel like most people are not aware of it, even large organizations that have a really strong regulatory team. So basically, when you do your registration, if you fall into where you have a predicate device, you can show substantial equivalency, then you go through what's called a 510K, a pre-market approval process through the FDA. So about 50% of those product codes, that's how you classify your product, are are eligible, sorry, for the third party program, and only 2% of devices actually go through the third party program. And so it's really about awareness. A lot of companies are not aware that this program exists. And so generally, instead of paying the fees that you would pay to the FDA, you would pay the fees to third party review organization, and they can expedite your review and your submission. And so you go through them as opposed to going through the FDA. We still liaison and partner with the FDA quite a bit, and so it's not done in isolation. We are trained, and we do need to consult with the FDA as well to just kind of show kind of what our thought process is and gain alignment on whether or not the device is showing substantial equivalency or not. But generally, we can review and approve in less than 60 days, and so it's quite fast. So if time to market's important, the cost is relatively competitive. It's not overly expensive compared to what you would submit to the FDA. But if time to market's important, then it makes sense to go through a third-party review organization.
Awesome. Okay, so on to the regular scheduled program. Define the first parts we want to start with. We talked about no code, low code, custom code. For those who are tuning in, I mean, some people might have a more advanced understanding of this, but let's just start with definitions. What does this mean? No code, low code, custom code.
Sure. So no code is a software development approach, as it's named, that requires very little programming skill. So typically it's visual. You'll see there's like drag and drop capabilities, maybe some connection points, and maybe some customization through configuration, but not necessarily coding. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're that easy to use, but typically someone with some business analyst type experience or IT, very limited programming experience, or someone that's technically savvy somewhat should be able to assemble an application fairly quickly. And just to give you like an example of what a no-code solution might look like WordPress is more considered a no-code versus low-code solution. There's a gray area there, but WordPress allows you to use native HTML for custom development, but you can build modern websites with zero coding, right? And so very capable, maintained websites with zero coding knowledge. So most website builders and forums and whatnot are low code. Airtable and Zapier are other popular examples. Zapier is an application that you can kind of connect other applications to, and generally it's kind of drag and drop, or it has fields that you map. So generally it's low code. I mean, sorry, it's no code.
No code. Okay. Yeah. So another example, I guess, just for me is like Wix, right? Where you could build a website on Wix, but it's okay. Got it. Understood.
Exactly. So it's low functionality, but it's still modern. You can do it quite fast, and it's pretty easy to.
Okay.
Low code is going to be similar to no code, but it probably has less abstraction. So like the no code has widgets that are very highly abstracted. And so low code is generally visual as well. But sometimes they integrate it with like custom and modern scripting applications. So it's generally suitable for IT, business analyst, etc. Someone who may not be trained as a software engineer, but quite technically savvy. So that's a higher level of savviness, I would say. And so like Salesforce is considered low code. So even though it's highly configurable and whatnot, like Salesforce app code is considered like a low code, and some popular IT automations are considered low code.
No kidding. Okay, very cool.
And then you have custom. So as it implies, it's done from scratch. It's generally with native programming languages like .NET, Angular, Java, JavaScript, React, etc. But a lot of custom code development pulls in third-party reusable software that was developed by a third party. So the third-party application is not necessarily no code or low code. It has an API that you interface with, but the benefit of using the third party is rapid development. And so this includes operating system, freeware, open source, paid licenses, things that have like typical functionality and features, but we're starting to see a lot of third-party software applications around AI.
Okay, awesome. So we're going to talk about pros and cons, right, of each of these at a high level, but can we talk just a little bit about let's maybe set the stage with how this applies to digital health, right? And then I'd like to maybe start diving into the pros and cons of each of these at a high level, and then we can kind of work our way down as we compare them.
Sure. So the trend we're seeing in digital health is kind of a mix. It's like a mix of
Okay.
all four approaches. And so I know we're focused on the three, but if you bring in the third-party software, it's kind of a mix. So I'd say
Okay.
that most digital health apps today are custom, right? They would be classified as custom, but they do rely heavily on third-party software and feature-rich data platforms. Give you an example, like in genomics, we have Lumina has a product which is called Lumina Connected Analytics. So even though it's really sophisticated, it could be considered low code, but it's not suitable generally for the end user, for the clinician, because it's very complex to use and it's not very user friendly, I would say, from an user interface perspective. So generally digital health companies will use ICA to develop the complex genomics based analysis, and then they would build a custom application on top. So that's an example of mixed, and Illumina Connected Analytics does rely on some third party software as well. So I would say that's mixed. Then we look at Galen's Data, our host today. Their platform is basically a managed and compliant cloud solution for data management and visualization. And so they're more suitable for the front end user because they have that visualization aspect to it, right? But again, using their platform, it could be a mix between your custom and third party software also integrated into Galen Data's platform. And then another example would be Flywheel, which is for rapid data capture and analysis and clinical data. So again, not very customer facing like the Illumina ICA Connected Analytics platform, but has an external interface that you can build your custom code on top. And so there's many no code solutions, but they're more focused. Like in industry, there's a lot of no code solutions, but they're more focused on EMR because I feel like that's more understood and common. And so very low risk and very simple clinical decision support software is starting to evolve out of the EMR no code platforms. But I would say at least, the custom development is probably most abundant, and it's a quite crowded market in terms of getting custom software developers.
Yeah, and Shawnnah, just this is this is a something I always ask because as I was learning, right, people would use analogies, and there's like 100 analogies and 100,000 analogies in medtech. EMR stands for
Electronic medical records. So anything that's managing patient data, generally you'll see there's like a lot of no code solutions. And it's
Mhm.
interesting because if you're managing patient data from a dental office perspective versus ophthalmic office, it's quite different workflow. But some of the key elements are there, which makes sense to have a no code solution where you can integrate the common pieces but establish a custom workflow. And then we're starting to see EMR because they actually contain the patient data, that it's starting to move into which I call CDS, which is clinical decision support software, which is regulated. So the EMRs aren't necessarily regulated. There's a medical device, I forget it's MDDS, I forget what the name stands for, medical device digital, I forget the name of the acronym, but there's actually a guidance from FDA that the EMR, EHR falls under, but it's quite light. But once you start getting into making clinical decisions using patient data, then you start entering that regulatory environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about that just for a second. We've had a whole, and I forget which one we had it on for the Galen Data webinar series, but we kind of talked about the regulatory path for some of these products, right? And clinical decision support products are a interesting way to get to market without making aggressive claims but collect data.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just highlight the difference between or the gray the gray area between a CDS product and something that might be in a 510K or a de novo or something like that?
Yeah, so I would say one, clinical decision is regulated. So if you wanted something unregulated, you're even before clinical decision support,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what you would be doing potentially to get to market early is you would be collecting data, right? And the key is that you collect it under, well-known protocols, and you maintain patient privacy. You comply with HIPAA, GDPR, if you're in the EU, CCPA if you're in California. But the key is that you get to market early and you collect the data so that you can inform clinical insights, right? So what it does, it allows you to get to market and start collecting data on the masses and be able to use that data as a training set, right? To be able to actually a development set, but also then ultimately, with a new set of data to serve as your training set. And so what it allows you to do is to create new clinical insights by learning and training on the data and seeing what actually the outcomes might be if the data is highly correlated and stuff like that. Then at that point, it allows you to use that data as real world evidence. FDA allows that. Again, you have to be properly controlled in protocols and whatnot, but in clean data, FDA allows you to take that data and then use it as part of your basis for your AI diagnostic, right? Then you get in a point where you're either AI clinical decision, which means you're alleviating the burden of a decision that a clinician would make, versus diagnostic, like you have this disease, yes or no, right? And that's kind of where it starts transitioning. But clinical decision support by definition is regulated, and there's different tiers, and it falls under the SAMD, basically risk classification for what you need to do to show, clinical significance or substantial equivalency and stuff like that.
Yeah, awesome. So pros and cons of each of these, and I'm kind of thinking of this as like a matrix, right? Where we have no code, low code, custom code at the top, right? And then down the side, it's user experience. It's I don't know, the other different things that you would probably compare them to, and then which ones are, get check boxes, and which ones have X's, and because they can't do it or it's harder to do it. So maybe just kind of set the stage for the pros and cons of each of these. I mean, what are some of the differences?
Yeah, so if I start with like no code, I'll say it's great for low risk products with very simple functionality. So the pros would be it's
Okay.
at least expensive.
Mm-hmm.
You have significantly faster deployment and development, easy to use. It's probably the easiest to use. Limited or no maintenance, right? Because it gets maintained by the platform. And then you have higher quality for those feature sets because they usually scale. So they have more users, right? And it's more standard. And so there's less variability. So it's probably higher quality, but it's low IP, right? So, and from a medical device manufacturer, digital health company, the IP is quite low because you're heavily reliant upon the no code solution. Cons with no code is you can have limited functionality. Again, high quality functionality, but limited, very limited or no customization at all. Limited or no regulatory support, compliance, and customer support. So right now, the no code solutions are in the EMR space. So generally, they don't have a lot of regulatory support. Probably not ISO 1345 qualified or certified. Sorry. And then the low code. So if you look at no code, you can think of it as like no ownership. So if you look at low code, it's more of a shared ownership. So low code is great for moderate risk products with common functionality with some minor customization. This allows you to focus on your IP. And actually, if you can think about it, the platform can sit on top of your IP, right? So you have some shared ownership there. The pros is it's gaining popularity. There's a reasonable cost. There's a lot of flexibility for custom development. There's low maintenance costs, and it's starting the platforms that are out there for digital health are actually tailored for the market, right? So if you look at Flywheel, they started out as being very tailored for the cardiology, and now they're extending into other markets, right? But their functionality is very suitable for that. Galen Data, I know they exercise other markets, but if you look at how they started, it was kind of like IOMT, right? Connecting sensor-based data and stuff like that, and starting to do some trending and some visualization of that data. And so it's very highly tailored, which means they understand the domain. And then you can keep your IP, right? So you can, even though the platform has a lot of shared code or reusable code, there's some customization there that could be your IP, and then integrating it with your analytics or what makes you special. The cons would be a limited customization. Again, it depends on the platform. Some limited regulatory support, although we're seeing like with Galen Data, they're 1345 certified, which is great and high trust. So that increases your ability to reuse that and as part of your submission because they are certified. You can rely on their design history file and their quality management system. They're generally focused on compliance in that specific area for data, right? High trust is more data focused, like data management, and also usually with the cons, I would say customer support kind of varies there. Depends on the company. And then for a custom, you have full ownership, right? It's yours. So even if
Hmm.
you outsource it, it's still yours. You generally own it. So fully custom. I believe this leads to higher valuations for future if you're planning on selling your company. You're in control of the quality. That could be good or bad for you. But generally, I think that's a pro because you can respond, have faster and more predictable response time to your customer. And it's very high IP, right? Which leads to the higher valuations. But it's the most expensive and it's the longest to develop. And so this is great for high risk products with complexity, with high complexity and new or novel functionality where maybe the low code and the no code doesn't have that level of sophistication that's needed. But like I said, I'm seeing more, the low code is moving more in popularity. So I see that shifting.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said there. We do this. I just putting my regulatory hat on. Is I look at this and the way you describe that is kind of how I describe 510K de novo and PMA sometimes, right? Um, there are massive exits for 510K products. There's no question about that, right? However, you have to show commercial traction to do that. With a de novo, there's nothing else like you on the market, right? You're different enough, right, that you've fallen into the de novo class. That does make exit a pretty good appeal for large strategics. And PMA, the same thing you said about a custom code, right? It's the longest to market. It's the most expensive. However, it also leads to really nice exits, right, for the people who found those. So it's just interesting the way you compared that. It was like I'm sitting there saying that's how exactly how I talk about some of the regulatory pathways sometimes for early stage startup companies.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's interesting to understand the valuation piece. So, I'll go into it a little bit more later, but it's really understanding where your IP actually lives, right? Are you a software company? Are you a hardware or chemistry company, right?
yeah,
And maybe your software is an enabler, but it's not necessarily your core differentiator, and maybe it's your chemistry, right? And then that's where you want to
hmm
focus your money and your effort and your time.
yeah. It's a great point. There's like a classic clip that goes around. About Elon Musk from Tesla, right? And the whole idea was like, if you look at Tesla as an electric car company, it's short-sighted of you. If you look at them as a data play, that's a long-term vision of the investment you would be making, that sort of thing, right? I'm not saying either one's right or wrong, but that's
Mhm.
the clip that flies around. And to your point, this kind of leads into the criteria, the evaluation criteria is, yeah, is your technology the hardware, like the actual physical medical device, or is it the software? Because that could inform whether you go no code or custom code or low code or some combination. So let's walk through that. Let's start with the evaluation criteria. Outside of your technology and what is really the value, what else is there for evaluation criteria as you're kind of going through this process for yourself?
Yeah, I would say one, there's no right or wrong answer, right? But there's an informed answer, right? Having an informed decision. And I would start with the needs of the business, right? So I mentioned a few things, but once you identify the needs of the business, I would look at selecting a few options based on that, and then performing what I call like a short feasibility cycle. But ensuring that you have like measurable criteria to make the determination whether that's cost, time to development, etc., that are aligned with your business goals. And so, like, what you don't want to do is jump into solution with a long-term contract. Some of these vendors have long-term contracts, and then find out that a major feature that your customers require because you didn't do due diligence with your customers and understand their needs didn't exist, or the functionality is limited and you're not able to configure it, right? Then you're kind of stuck. And remember, these solutions are the selection, even though there's no right or wrong answer. I think at the end of the day, there's a high switching cost associated with it, right? So you want to be very methodical and intentional. And if you decide to switch, that should be intentionally done, like a plan to switch once you make your solution. Um, the software like itself, when you're piloting it, like you hear all these things like, oh, we have this cool feature, but it never works as you expect it to work ever. And so you're like, I thought they said it has this feature. Well, they did, but it's not very mature and it's very limited. And so for the areas that are important, you can prioritize them. You want to make sure it works as you expect, right? You don't want to figure that out after the fact. And many of these solutions have free trials that you can play around with. They're usually limited, but if they know you're serious and that you're piloting it and you need more time, sometimes they'll work around and extend the trial for you so that you can really make sure that their solution meets your needs. And so a few things to consider is cost over time. We mentioned that before. Customization needs, we talked about that a little bit. Customer service, I think that's really important. So regardless what solution you pick, it's really important to understand customer service model. It becomes really important in the digital health space, especially if you're regulated, because you need to be able to respond, especially if there's a potential to patient harm, right? And now cybersecurity. There's a requirement now that you respond if it's high risk or it could potentially impact a patient within 30 days, right? So that's pretty quick turnaround. So that's a good consideration, regardless what you choose. And then there's the regulatory compliance piece, as I mentioned, right? Lower risk, right? Higher risk products, higher risk to the patient require more regulatory rigor. And that's kind of hard to do if your supplier doesn't actually operate in that regulatory space, right? Even though they sell to the market, they may not operate and be experts in that space. And it's going to rely heavily on you to validate that solution.
Yeah, it's a great point. So what about hiring versus outsourcing or a combination of both, right? Like I feel like this is also, it's like you're going through the evaluation process and all the things you described, I guess, they're not really financial either, right? Of like how much this is going to cost and that sort of thing. It's interesting because sometimes the biggest mistake I've seen is they've went right to the financial piece of like, oh, I could build this cheaper than if I use this or that, and that to me seems like you figure that that's like the last thing to maybe consider, right? Which it sounds ridiculous, but I think it is. And so kind of walk me through this, right? I mean, do you hire? Do you outsource? Is it maybe a stepwise fashion of outsourcing, then hiring?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Walk me through some of those decisions.
Yeah, so I think again, it depends on the needs of the business, as you mentioned. And it also goes back to, are you a software or hardware company, right? Or a science company or an AI company, right? A data company, right? That's really important to denote. Like, where are you going to make your money and where do you need the substance, right, within your company to be able to support that mission and vision. So I think it's really important to have that understanding and to know whether or not you want to have full ownership or oversight. For example, like, do you even have the expertise to hire a software engineering team? And if not, maybe that's not wise for you to start doing that without actually understanding like how to vet them and how to actually build a software team. Like, for example, my company, we're software developers, right? That's where we come from, and we're putting a lot of effort, sales and marketing, and we've got to the point where like, okay, we don't know what we're doing, so we need to bring in experts to help because they've done it before. And why are we trying to learn from scratch? It's great and notable and we think we're smart enough, but we just don't have the time or like the know-how. So it makes sense in some cases to hire someone that's done it before, right? Can that do it quicker, faster, and give you realistic, and I think you mentioned like some people are thinking they can build it cheaper, faster, because software development is quite expensive. It's significantly more expensive than building a hardware, right? And so when you make those correlations, it's very hard to swallow, right? To say, okay, I'm going to invest like almost a couple million just to develop software. That's ridiculous. And that's why I think that no code and low code solutions are an option, right? And they're starting to become popular because there's a lot of reuse that can be taken advantage of stuff that we're building time and time again for the medical device. But I would say, I think it would be useful to kind of look at like considering your core team and then complementing the team with outsourced resources. That would be my recommendation, especially for a startup. And then I'll kind of go over some typical outsourcing models that I've seen. So, you can do offshore and near shore. This is like, I would say for lower risk feature and reduced costs. Like if you're going to hire cheap resources, you get what you pay for. And there's a lot of great nearshore and offshore development companies, right? But I would say they're not experts in your domain per se, and they require a lot of oversight and understanding of what your product requirements are, right? There's a language barrier, there's all kinds of stuff, and I would say I would use that and take advantage of the lower cost, but for lower risk features. Right, the more sophisticated features, I would recommend hiring subject matter expertise to actually develop out those features. Um, and then I guess the other idea, as I mentioned, subject matter expertise, but like key areas are things that you're going to do like once maybe and refine, like your core IP, maybe like image processing or AI, if you're not an image processing expert or AI, but you need that to serve like your market in terms of providing clinical insights for maybe digital health or image processing of sophisticated data, then you should look into hiring a subject matter expertise that has that background, right? Something that you don't necessarily need to scale. You need it for the initial phase, and then once it's developed, then you're kind of sustaining it from there. Another way I've seen outsourcing work is you outsource a portion of your team and then you start scaling up your team. So you really have to know, like, when your first launch occurs, like, you generally need a smaller team. So then you can scale down easily because you didn't hire them. Because what I've seen is sometimes they'll hire, more team members than necessary, and then they have to lay off shortly after because of burn. Software engineers are quite expensive. The other thing I would say is just hiring a full outsource team. We've seen that. And then also obviously integrating with your own staffing plans, right? So generally you can hire outsource first and then use them to help you hire and train your own engineers, and then start slowly scaling them down as it makes sense. And then I think I can go through a few mistakes too. So one of the big things I've seen is not understanding the resources you need to deliver, right? So if you're not a software engineer expert or software product development expert, but you're building a software-based product, you need to understand, okay, what is it going to take for, how many AI resources do I need? How many back-end developers, front-end developers, full stack developers, architect, etc. Like, really understanding that mix is important. The other one I think I mentioned before, though, is just not knowing how to vet the technical resources. That's when you can rely on maybe technical recruiters or companies that have done it before. We've seen people deciding to do it all themselves really cheap and ramping up, and then needing to lay off later and they weren't able to deliver, but also because they overstaffed. And then the big one is not having solid requirements for your product. If you're going to outsource, you need to understand your end users, and you need to be able to translate that into product specifications so that your outsourced partner or partners know exactly what you're building. If you don't have that, you don't really have a contract.
That's a great point. I went on mute because there's a loud motorcycle riding down the street here. But so realistic expectations in terms of cost and time. I'm sure you love this question, but to frame it up, give us some ballpark, some idea. I mean, what are people looking at? Time most important, cost to do the best you can, right? But
Yeah. So I think cost can vary, but custom's going to be by far the most expensive, but it might be the most cost effective in the long run and have higher ROI for the business. So that's something to consider. We did discuss the increased business valuation and IP ownership. So again, if you're planning to sell your company, custom might be a better consideration, especially if you consider yourself more of a software company, especially for SAMD, right, versus SIMD, because the investors will deem you having reliance on the platform, and the IP is owned by the platform, not so much you. So you'll get in those conversations where if it's custom, they know it's solely, they can evaluate the software as an asset because you have ownership over that asset. So that's really important. Whether you believe that or not doesn't matter. I mean, that's what the investors are looking at from a valuation perspective. That's something to consider. No code, I mean, you can be up in a few days sometimes, or a few months. So it's the lowest cost because these solutions they're generally sold at scale, right? So they have a large user base. They're usually less expensive, and they're sold at subscriptions, so like month to month or year. So the no code trial or pilot is pretty low risk, right? So if you think no code might be suitable and you're not sure, or you need to get something up and running to do a dog and pony show for your investors, but you need the investment to do either the low code or custom platform solution, or custom development solution rather, no code might be a good way to get you something pretty quick. Low code can also get you something quick, but I would say generally like less than 6 months. I would say about 3 to 6 months. Usually, I'm not sure what the market is, but usually what I'm seeing is like it's the cost of one software engineer or less. Again, because they're selling to multiple clients, and so they're paying for you're paying for the engineers that are working on features that other clients need, right? And so generally you're paying for like the cost of an engineer. They usually have longer commitments, contractual commitments, and I've seen annually or 3 years with discount. And I think because there's that customization aspect of low code, that it tends to be a little bit more expensive than the no code, because the no code's more like a widget, right? Mm-hmm. Custom takes the longest. I mean, I've worked on SIMD. If it's a SIMD product, it could take 5 to 10 years. a genomic clinical assay could take 10 years, but it's on the data collection piece, and usually because there's a PMA, right? But let's say, it's something moderate sophistication, whatnot, very effective team. I would say maybe 18 to 36 months. So it has a longer timeline and a greater variance. And when I say, 18 to 36 months, I'm talking about MVP. I'm not talking about the final production unless it's SAMD only. And so you can reduce the timeline, though, as I mentioned before, by outsourcing, right? Hiring consultants that have the know-how. They've done it before. A lot of these consultants that work in medical device industry or in digital health, they usually have a repository of reusable code. So it might not be like plug and play like you see with the low code or no code, but they have code that they can take as a starting point that they have IP ownership over that can get you a fast product.
Okay.
The cost could vary. I've seen mobile apps around 250K, right, for a basic mobile app, but I've also seen development for several $1,000,000. And so
Wow.
it really is going to depend. It can be quite expensive. And that's why I think I'm seeing a mix, right? We're seeing a mix of people using third party off the shelf for low risk functionality because they don't want to build it themselves, using a platform for the data back end piece, right, or analytics and stuff like that. That's where you're kind of seeing the trend. And then the custom development is kind of on the top front end user facing, and also their back end, which is not the back end but the analytic part, right? They're usually experts in their own IP, so that usually makes sense for them to take that development versus outsourcing it.
Yeah, I wonder if some of the disconnect too with like the price of what it takes to build custom code has to do with like when someone says, "Hey, I'll build you a prototype and then I'll manufacture it for you and do all this," right? Some of these places that do contract manufacturing, you'll get a quote for like $1,000,000 and it's not shocking, right? But they're building a physical product. I think the perception is like when you build this custom code project, you're like, but yeah, you can't see it, right?
Yeah,
Like you can't see it
tangible.
necessarily, and so the thought is it's going to be way less, right? And turns out it's not, right? It's kind of similar price ranges, and you pay for what you get, right? So I just think that's interesting. I wonder if that's like just like human nature of being like, oh, this should be lower cost because it's not something like I can't pick up this device, right? But
Yeah, perhaps. We did a webinar a while ago called How to Monetize Software, and excuse me, the focus was a lot on medical device manufacturers, again, for SIMD, right? They're not SAMD. They want to move into SAMD and they have a problem doing that because they've never monetized their software. They don't know how. And they're coming traditionally from a hardware background, right? Or a science background, generally hardware for more like the Medtronics of the world and stuff like that. And so they've monetized the hardware because they know how to do cost of goods. They know what it costs to manufacture. They know what the cost of the parts are, right? But they don't know how to cost the software because it's an R&D cost, right? Because when you do cost of goods, you don't include R&D. That's like a sunk cost. And so software is all R&D, so it's a sunk cost basically. But they don't look at it in terms of a profit center. And when you look at these companies, because I've worked at these companies, majority of the R&D team are software engineers. Even for SIMD, that primarily being sold on this razor blade model, right? The placing the device, selling it, sometimes even at cost, and then making money off the consumable, right? They can make money off the software, but the whole industry has to shift because the customers aren't used to paying for it.
yeah, right. I love it. All right. So what about kind of going through the list here? Ongoing maintenance. What does it require? What's required? What it looks like? You've kind of touched on this a little bit, right? Of like the three different ones, but I guess answering it very succinctly. I mean, what does that look like? What's required?
Yeah, so for no code, the maintenance is typically included. I think read the
Yeah.
fine print in your contract. They generally maintain the platform. For larger, more mature vendors, I would say if issues appear, they generally have the support technical staff to help you resolve the issue pretty quickly. But it depends on the customer service policy. So some might be fast to respond, while others maybe put you in a dark hole and require you to figure, leaving you stuck. But this is concerning if you're using a no-code solution and it has high patient safety impact, right? So keep that in mind. I think it's really important when you're looking at a no-code or even low-code solution. You're really focused on the quality of the product, any sort of regulatory compliance, and the responsiveness of the company. Because for no-code, you don't have control. unless you're configuring certain pieces, you can get around that, but you might have to disable features and escalate to them. They may not serve your market primarily. They might have a great solution for your product, but they may not serve your market, so they may not be as responsive as you expect. And so that's important. Um, for low code as well, maintenance is typically included, so that's why you have the subscription cost. But I would say there's more of a gray area. So if there's an issue around limited custom code, you, because you wrote the custom code, might need to spend time proving that it's not your side versus theirs, as opposed to them doing the other way around, right? And so you have to spend some time to say, hey, I wrote this custom code, but I believe it's the platform, it's not me. So I would say for this one, given the solution is more custom than the no-code solution, it could be trickier to identify the root cause of the problem. And again, the responsiveness is going to be based on the service agreement. Like, make sure it has in there like response time for issues that are found, and that there's an actual mature issue tracking system or ticketing system where you can put in your request and they guarantee a response within a certain amount of time. I think that would be important because you're serving, again, the medical device community. If it was a different market, that could be less of concern. But there is an expectation, again, for cyber that you respond within 30 days and for a cyber threat that could introduce patient harm. So it's really important to consider the responsiveness. In
Awesome.
custom code, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, no, keep going. Yeah, custom code. Yep.
Yeah, in custom code, surprise, you own the maintenance. So you own the maintenance unless you outsource, that you might have a sustaining agreement with your supplier. That's really important to make sure. Usually it's based on retainer so that they can secure the resources, because generally when you outsource and you're not working with them anymore, they go to another product, another client. So paying for the retainer, I would say, is worth it. Even though you think you don't need it, you probably will. So you're in charge of the responsive time, again, unless you're outsourcing. So to get a fixed market, you can respond relatively quickly and address the cybersecurity issues or patient safety issues.
Okay.
So again, I'll just reiterate, for low code and no code or outsourced custom development, make sure you review your service agreement, or you have a service agreement in place. Review it carefully, understand the expectations that your market expects, your customers, and the impact to patient safety and the risk to your business. And so I think that's really important when you're considering low code and custom or outsource.
Mm-hmm. I wonder too. I mean, just like from our side of things, right? We're working with quite a few software companies that their end customer is the hospital system, right? And getting through a value analysis committee is hard enough as it is when you are bringing a product to market. It doesn't matter whether it's a heart valve or it's a diagnostic software tool. But the added layer when an IT department within a hospital has to get involved makes it exponentially harder because the IT departments are slammed and there's a lot they have to go through for cybersecurity and how it integrates, and there's a lot of different things. And so I'm wondering from your perspective, and this isn't something we really talked about, but it's a question that's just kind of come up as we've been talking now, and it's, does one of these solutions make it easier to get into? Like, it just feels as if on the surface, right, if I was using Galen data as an example as my cloud rather than building a custom cloud, that would be easier to get in through a healthcare IT department than building a custom cloud.
Not necessarily, unless Galen data already has traction within these hospital systems that
Okay.
you can sell into, because that
Okay.
means they've already addressed those hurdles,
Okay.
right? So the IT, to your mention, has their own requirements. So unless Galen data, like for example, sorry to pick on Galen,
Yeah.
sorry to pick on our sponsor. So unless Galen data has done that research for you and vetted, like key hospital systems would be like 80% of hospital systems require these requirements, and we address them, then I would say not necessarily, right?
Okay.
And no code solutions, I would say, because they're more EMR based, probably actually have the most experience in the healthcare systems, and they are responsible for it. So I guess it would be where the responsibility lies, right? So if Galen Data is claiming that they're responsible for the IT integration issue into the hospital system, then it's in
Okay.
their best interest to understand those requirements within the hospital system. And it's
Okay.
less of a burden on the medical device manufacturer. But one thing I want to point out that I didn't point out, as a digital health company, you are a medical device manufacturer if you're clinical decision support or a diagnostic, right? You are
Hmm.
regulated. When you're regulated, you are responsible for whatever happens. So regardless if you use no code, you use
Okay.
low code or custom, you're the medical device manufacturer. The buck stops with you, and you're responsible for addressing those issues. So you can go back to your vendor and sue them or get into dispute and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you're responsible, right? The
Okay.
liability is with you and not with your supplier, unless your supplier itself is a medical device manufacturer, which I've seen. So there
Okay.
are some platforms that will clear themselves as an open platform for a specific disease or specific clinical decision that you can interface to, but they're cleared as a medical device. And if so, then the issues on their end, they're responsible for. You're responsible for yours. And then the integration point is where you need to de-risk your product, is where you interface with their device, with their solution. I've seen that because a lot of like IoT solutions are relying on sensors or acquired data from other instruments that the digital health manufacturer doesn't own, but they're using the data coming in, like a heart monitor, pulse oximeter, all this stuff, and then deriving clinical insights, right? So they own that piece, right? And then if they're getting bad data in, they have to protect themselves from the other medical device manufacturer. But if there's a bug in the sensor technology that's doing the recording, that medical device manufacturer responsible for that device owns that issue. Does that make sense?
It does. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Super helpful. Um, so you've kind of sprinkled it in throughout the entire discussion here, but of how your decision will affect your go-to-market in the near term and long term. Um, and I know there's no right or wrong answer here, right? But
Yeah.
but what how will these decisions you make now affect near and long term go-to-market strategies?
Okay, yeah, sure. I think evaluation, I brought that up several times. It's really
Yeah.
important. And I think it can be an oversight. The other one is like time to market. I think with a no code solution, unless you're a software engineer like me that could develop an app pretty quickly, the no code solution allows you to fail fast. So it's great for market uncertainty, right? So if you have something and you need to validate the investors or validate the market, it's great to go with a low cost, very fast develop something that you can iterate pretty quickly on for that market uncertainty. The other one is upfront investment. You may not have the luxury. You may want to do custom code development. You may not have the luxury, right? So you need to bridge somehow to get to the point where you can showcase your capabilities and demo and validate your product and get investment because you don't have that upfront investment. Future need for customization. So maybe a low code solution might make sense, but at the end of the day, like maybe I think you gave an example, right? Go out there and you collect the data, right? So you're not really a medical product, and maybe that's a low code solution where you're collecting data and you're providing something neat to the end user, but it's not clinical based or diagnostics or anything like that. It's not regulated, or maybe lightly regulated, like lower risk, maybe a class one. Um, for that, that's good. But if at the end of the day, like you're going to build something sophisticated, then you may want to have kind of a joint strategy where you start with low code and then you start figuring out what your start with no code or low code and then start figuring out your strategy moving forward. So think about the level of customization and how you're going to scale your business. And then patient safety risk. That one's a big one, right? The higher the risk to the patient, I would say the more control you tend to want to have. And that doesn't mean don't outsource anything or reuse any software that's there. There's plenty of software that's really high quality, but you need to consider that in terms of if there's an issue, how is that going to impact your ability to respond?
Awesome. So we're going to go into some audience questions. We had a few come in before we actually even started the webinar. So I'm going to start with those. Just a reminder for anyone still listening in, if you have questions, drop them in there. We'll get to those now. You can also see on here on your screen contact information for Galen Data, but also contact information for Shawnnah at BeanStock Ventures here, excuse me. So that's both on the screen right now. Question that came in, Shawnnah. I am interested in the approach of BeanStock Ventures of the medical device market and how you handle international multi-site implementations.
Oh, that's a fun one. So, FDA has some standards that they call recognized consensus standards, which are great, right? So if you have like maybe IC 62304, for example, for software, it's a EU based standard. So if you follow that, you can comply with EU, right? EU MDR now, and then you can comply with the FDA. So what we do for our customers from that perspective, that's just a small example, right? But you're talking about big globalization. And we do work with really large multinational organizations, and the goal is to harmonize, right? Understand what markets they're going into, understand the regulation and guidances, and then harmonize it. What you'll end up finding is that they use maybe some different terms and whatnot. And it seems like every regulatory body right now wants to be special. Like you see the UK branching out from EU, and they started building their own quality, regulatory governing body for medical devices. They have their own regulation and whatnot. They're not relying on EU. And so the key is to get an expert that can actually read guidances, that understand, right? Because it's like legal jargon, but also technical jargon. So it's quite complicated, but understand it so they can harmonize. So they okay, 80% of this is the same regardless where you're going. And here's the subtleties. And usually for large organizations, we recommend that when they build their product, they don't differentiate, they follow the global standard. But in some cases, the subtleties could be cost prohibitive, like maybe for a smaller company, then we would differentiate the cost based on the market they want to enter. And usually they're entering in like a couple, right? So for example, usability for EU might have lower requirements in terms of participants than the US, and the participants for usability increase your costs, right? And so we would disclose that with our clients to say, okay, you could do one first, because generally they do one and then stage the other, or you can do it together, but no, you're going to pay this much money because you're trying to satisfy both. But when you're a large multinational global organization, generally it's one process that everyone follows. So when they decide to go into a specific market, it's more of a regulatory burden and not a product development burden.
Okay, awesome. The next question, so there's two more. Please include discussions of deeply embedded firmware with smaller microcontrollers, 16-bit and 32-bit in parentheses, with little or no internet linkage.
In terms of what? Can I ask a question back? Is it in terms of cybersecurity or low code, no code, custom code?
I think it'd be in terms of that, but not sure. This question came in ahead of time, so I don't know
What
if
was the
they're on
last?
the
Is it
webinar or not.
no connectivity?
Yeah, little to no internet linkage.
Okay, so
Yep.
I'll focus from a cybersecurity perspective, and I'll talk
Okay.
about like open source software and platforms and whatnot. Okay,
Perfect.
so when you're building a medical device, electromechanical, if it's electrical, it's going to have firmware, right? Whether it's off the shelf or custom and whatnot, right? That's kind of depends. But at the end of the day, it falls under cybersecurity guidance. So I've had questions like, well, it's just firmware, it's very simple, so it doesn't comply with cyber. That's not true. If you look at the definition, FDA does call out, and other regulators call out firmware on purpose, right? So firmware is considered software from the FDA's lens. I consider firmware software
Okay.
as a software engineer. So whether am I good at coding firmware? Probably not, right? Because I'm not close to the electronics, but it's still considered software. So from that perspective, that's kind of FDA's perspective of it. If you don't have a connected device, it's not about the connectivity, it's about the potential to connect. So if you have an exposed port, like a USB port, that can be connected to a PC, and the PC is then connected to the network, then they call that like a potential attack vector. And when you move along that journey, you have to consider it from a risk analysis perspective, right? So you have to understand what could happen, and then if it does happen, what's the harm to the patient? And then if there is patient harm based on that probability, et cetera, then you need to put some mitigations in place. So just because it's not connected, and it's just because it's firmware doesn't mean it's excluded from cyber. It's definitely included. And if it's not connected, it's still included because of the potential to connect. And that's FDA's stance on it. And I actually just spoke on that yesterday, so that's the perfect question.
Awesome. Awesome.
Otherwise, I don't know if I'd be able to answer it, but
yeah. Last question. And this is, I'm guessing, again, related to no code, low code, custom code. Do regulators care of your choice? are downstream changes, say for a continuous improvement, version control, product upgrades, or FDA quality compliance harder or easier with the different options? I think you've kind of addressed that, but we can ask this question still.
Yeah, actually, not directly. So
Yeah.
it's going to depend on the risk to the patient, right? So, like no code, potentially better for lower risk, but not necessarily. But if your vendor is ISO 1345, then you know that they have a medical device grade quality management system, right? But you're still responsible for submitting the specifications to the FDA, which means if you're all no code solution, you still have to submit some sort of design history file, which is technical, right? So lower risk is easier because you there's less documentation required, and you can validate more of the solution and write your own requirements against how you're configuring it and test it and whatnot, right? But for higher risk, how would you, if you're doing a no code solution, how, if your vendor is not providing the documents, how would you satisfy FDA's requirement for design specification, which is the underworkings of the design? You don't have access to that, right? So that's how you would consider, is basically take your product classification, look at the deliverables required for the submission, and then based on that, look at your vendor and seeing what they actually provide. And that's why you're seeing kind of a mixed solution, because the no code isn't really, in some cases, isn't the clinical piece, right? So when you're submitting to the FDA, it's all around the part of the software that mostly can impact, safety and efficacy, right? And that's where you generally want to have the more control over. But FDA doesn't care, right? I mean, they care about you following the requirements. There is guidance around off-the-shelf software use, right? Which I would say no code and low code would be considered when it's a black box, open, whatever, third-party software. Sorry, not open source, but third-party software. So off-the-shelf software, there is guidance for that. And you generally have to understand how you're using it, how it integrates to your product. You have to validate it for your intended use, right? You have to assess the risk. So same things you would do, but it's a black box, so it's a little bit harder if you find issues. So that's why I'm recommending the MVP and doing the MVP as it relates to the patient risk, right? And your understanding to your business needs, because that's going to help you with your solution. And I think in some cases it may make sense, like I said, to do the no code, knowing that you need to fail fast, and then knowing that your product might be higher risk, hence you need to have more control, and then you migrate to another solution that allows you to have more control.
Awesome. Shawnnah, that is all the questions that we had, and that takes us almost all the way until 2 o'clock Eastern time. So this is great. First off, want to let everyone know who's listening in, the 34th installment of the Galen Data Webinar Series will be July 25th, which is a Tuesday. There'll be a slight shift in time. It'll be either 2 p.m. or 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so you can adjust from there. But stay tuned for that announcement. And then Shawnnah, thank you for donating an hour of your time today and educating us on this topic and the different considerations. I know personally I learned a lot. That's not an area I know too much on, so I appreciate it. And thanks for all the attendees for attending, listening in, asking questions. And for more information on Galen Data or BeanStock Ventures, the contact information is on your screen right now. And thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.